everybody. So today what we're doing, the dreaded rear motor mount. Now I've actually done most of this project 4 or 5 times, so it's not really a big deal. We do have to pull the intake manifold out. We're gonna probably just pull the fuel rail off, lay it to the side. We got to take the intake pipe off. Now the first thing, I've got to preface all of this like I have to do most of these videos. This is not what your engine's going to look like, okay? This is a totally different animal than what you're going to have. But the process is going to be the same. Your PCV valve will come off. Yours will actually just lift out of there. I'm going to have to undo my AN lines here and the one on the intake manifold here. I'm going to have to undo my breather here, but you're going to have a hose that goes from here to your intake. Now your first intake tube is going to be mostly the same. I'm going to pull my first tube off here, get it out of the way. The most difficult part of this project for me is always right here. And this is the throttle cable. And this is the most difficult part for me always. It hurts my fingers every time I do it. I've tried from both unbolting it from the manifold and just taking the cable out of the butterfly on the throttle body, and that's probably what I'm going to end up doing, but I'm not looking forward to doing that part at all. I might actually pull off the strut bar too, just to make a little bit more room for me. You are going to have cruise control where my catch cans are. That will be 2 bolts off to the side here. I would just unbolt it and lay it off to the side so you have a little bit more room to work. But pulling the intake manifold is by far the easiest way to do this, unless you're pulling the engine, and most of us don't do that, and I'm terrified to have to do that when the time comes. But this is just some bolts. Hopefully we're not going to ruin the intake manifold gasket that I've replaced fairly recently. There's a video on how to do that. Hopefully that won't be that big of a deal. And I just noticed that my hood is dirty again, even though I cleaned under here. And we can get that intake manifold off without breaking the gasket. If we do break it, luckily O'Reilly's is 5 minutes from my house and it's a $10 gasket. So let me get some tools out. Unfortunately, I guess we just better jump into this. So we'll cut back and I'll start removing here my AN lines, get them out of the way, in the strut tower brace. And if you're one of those people, disconnect the battery. So this is after the intake tube is out, and like I said, the crankcase breather is just a tube that goes here to your intake, and I have rags over my intake manifold so we don't mess up my pretty powder coating here. And I always stick a rag in a situation like this, so the throttle body, okay? So you don't drop something in there unknowingly, a nut, a bolt, whatever, dirt doesn't get in there unnecessarily. So plug that so we don't get any mess in there. I've got my AN lines put back. I still have to pull off the rest of my PVC or PCV, but that'll just pull out for you, and I'll pull out of here. But the amount of jokes that I could make. So next is going to be the fuel rail. Now I'm not going to actually disconnect the wires except the knock sensor wire here. Might be able to do that one. Actually, while on here, maybe. I probably can do this, but you know what? No. Let's not force anything to be fun. So, knock sensor is going to be unplugged, but the rest of this, and most of you are going to have 4 bolts for your fuel rail. I only have 2. So, my 2 are here, and there's one here. And the rest of you are probably going to have one here and here, where I actually use these holes, the mounting holes, to hold my AN lines. So you're going to undo those. I believe they're 12 millimeter. Yes, and they're going to pull out, and then the fuel rail will actually lift out with the injectors in it, and everything can come out. Oh, and we'll remove our vacuum line for our fuel pressure regulator. And be sure that you don't lose your vacuum lines. And if you've got old vacuum lines, be gentle with them. They are fragile. So remove these 2 bolts, and the fuel rail I'm actually going to lay back over here. I'm going to put some more rags on the intake and stuff like that. And I'm going to tip that back out of the way. And then we'll actually get to the meat and potatoes of what this is going to be. Here we are with the rest of my AN lines pulled out. Fuel rails flipped over. The next things that we need to do Right down there is the EGR pipe. If you still have your EGR, we're gonna get to there. Now for you, good luck getting to it. I think I went in from this direction over here. I might have gone in from underneath, but for me, since I have a 626 intake manifold, I can get to it right here, and I've taken that off many times and it's never seized really well. So I can get that out of there pretty easily with a crescent wrench. So we're gonna loosen that. I think the next thing we're gonna do, you can see the back of them right down, hold on. I'm being a very bad camera operator right now. Okay, you can see the back of those two bolts on the rear support for the intake manifold. Those are 14 millimeter. I can actually reach those from the top here as well. You can try, maybe, if you have a really strong, cute little girlfriend, you can have her reach back there and get those off. Otherwise, you might have to go from below the car to get those. And we're gonna do those two bolts, the EGR pipe down there, the throttle cable, which I hate so much. I hate it so much. And unless you've done the throttle body coolant bypass, which I have not, I think it's going to be best if we take these two lines off right here as well. I'm trying to go from memory from the last time I actually removed the entire intake manifold. This one here, and there's another one right here, if we can see with the light. This one here, and they're just a little pinch clamp. We can pull these two off, and that's going to free the throttle body up completely. And we can, oh, we'll probably have to disconnect the wires there. I believe that's EGR for the wires. I believe so, unless there's another one underneath it. There might be, and I just can't remember. I think that actually might be the throttle positioning sensor. No, that's here. So we're going to have to undo throttle positioning sensor. I believe that's EGR. We're going to have to remove that set of wires right there. Throttle cable back here. EGR. And the back of these two 14s, which I can get from reaching around, doing a little reach around here. And I believe after that, we can get to the actual bolts that hold the intake manifold to the head. And those are, let's see, there's one here, there's one underneath this runner, there's one there, here, and there's a couple more around. But this actually isn't too bad. This is the easiest part. And then intake manifold should be able to lift out along with the throttle body. We'll probably set that thing aside somewhere so we have a little bit of room in the engine bay. Now that I think about it, we are definitely going to take off those coolant lines so we can get that entire mess out of this engine compartment, because we're going to need some elbow room to get to that motor mount. And I'm really hoping it's not going to be in there too tight from when I put in the last mount, and I'm not going to struggle for it here. But I hate to tell you, if this is the first time you've ever got to that motor mount, there's a lot of horror stories, so it's best if you give yourself as much room and elbow play as possible so you can get big wrenches down there. You're probably going to need 1/2-inch drive and cheater bars and everything else. So I digress. Let's do all that I said with those wires and everything else. And don't know what that is, but there is in fact the EGR is under there. So whatever that one is, I'm sure comments will say eventually. So we'll pull those out, get that out of there, and we'll get to it from there. So where we're at now, there is a big vacuum line, the biggest one, plugs onto back here on the back of the intake manifold, and it actually goes up to your brake booster. Now, I have a vac block, so I actually took mine off the vac block because that was very difficult for me to get on with my relocated wiring and stuff. So the throttle cable was everything that I feared, but it came off clean. And then there were two 10mm bolts on the back of the intake manifold to actually get the bracket off. Now I will show you what this looks like, so it might be easier for you. So if you push in these 4 prongs, 2 on each side, you can actually slip this out of the bracket, but I couldn't get my fingers on it, so I just took the bracket off. But going back on will be easier. I'll bolt the bracket to the manifold, and then I will hook the cable to the throttle body. mechanism, and then I will actually plug it into the bracket. So going on will be a lot easier for that for me. So I've loosened the pinch clamps on both of these. I'm about ready to pull them off. I cannot reach the EGR, so I'm going to wait till I actually get the intake manifold loose so I can pull it back and move it over and actually get that off. I'll do that very last. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break loose all of the bolts along the intake manifold here. One, there's another one behind there, 2, 3 in the middle, 4, 5 is the nut on the stud, and then number 6 is underneath this runner here. And I've already got the 14s out on the dog bone bracket down there. So, like I said, I'm going to pull these bolts off and get this intake manifold loose. Be careful of your gasket if you're not going to replace. If you are, doesn't matter. And then I'm going, after I get the intake manifold loose, I'm going to pull these off, remove the intake manifold, and then get that EGR and get this out of here, and then we'll go from there. Well, I broke my gasket, so I'm going to have to buy another gasket. This will be the 4th or 5th one I've had to buy for this car, and I'm getting tired of buying them if I'm honest. All right, so there we go. That's what we're after. Right here. Now, this is a main support mount, so you are going to have to put a jack or something underneath the back of the engine. I usually use a block of wood and a screw jack underneath the corner of the oil pan to support it. Or since we're so far over to the side here, we can actually put it underneath the bell housing where it mounts to the engine and hold the tension off the mount so we can get it loose. And now I'm getting a phone call again. So basically we've got to remove the 3 bolts here that are going to be tight and this one here and move the harness out of the way. So I feel that one of the biggest questions people have, including myself when I did this, because I'll be honest, I did struggle with it. I want to show the setup that I used to actually get this out of here without breaking anything so far that I know of. So I have a 17mm deep socket and I have a good quality 3/8 universal joint. And the back 2 are the hardest for me. So you want to make sure that you get the socket on there square and all the way, because this is where you're going to round out this nut, because they are really on there. And keep in mind, I did this already a couple of years ago and I almost buttoned it up and gave up because I didn't think I was going to go without breaking something. So I went inside, I had a drink, cracked open a beer, and I decided, well, if I break something, I break something. I have the week off, I'll just fix when I break. So I have 2 extensions, so we can see the length that I'm going with here. Now I actually braced up here as high as I could to keep the strain off the universal joint because I thought I was going to break it. And I have a Craftsman ratchet. I do not advocate for Craftsman. I hate them. This is the 3rd one of these ratchets I had. I do not like them. You go in there to replace it, they don't even give you a new one. They give you a freaking rebuilt one, and it's garbage. I hate Craftsman, but whatever. So I have an 18-inch pipe for my cheater, is what I did. So I got as much purchase as I could on it, and I did use gloves because I was afraid of slipping and ripping all of the skin off my hands. And I braced it and I put a twist on these extensions so much I really thought I was going to twist another one in half like I had before, not in this application. And they came loose. They came loose with a bang, so loud that everything fell apart on my setup here. But they've all come loose. All 3 of the bolts on the back. Now, another thing that people ask is, how do I get off the plastic guard for the wiring harness? Now, what I've done, it is just a plastic piece here. I'll bring you guys in so you can see what's going on here. It is just a piece of plastic that wraps around here. You see it's got these 2 holes. And one of the bolts, the studs, is right here. And the other one is right down here. The other one is right down, right down there above the back nut for the motor mount. Well, as you can see, it's been bent over. That's because I took a punch and a hammer and beat it over like it owed me money and was cheating on me and lying about it for 3 years. So I don't really care about using two bolts to hold on a plastic surround that holds the wiring harness because there's another one right there. So I still have the one, so I just beat that out of the way. You know, race car, so whatever. It's been fine for the last 3 years I've been running it. So anyway, those are loose now. The big one here that you can see next to the bushing, that one was super easy. I just took a 1/2 inch drive 17 millimeter and put a grunt to it and it came loose. So everything on here is now loose. Praise every deity that you may or may not pray to, because my knees are killing me from leaning over this car like this. I'm too old. So now that that's all done, I'm going to make sure the engine's supported good underneath the bell housing. I think I've got to jack it up a little bit more, but to show you what I've done here, see if I can extend you guys under there a little further. So you can, well, just pulled my tripod apart so you can see better what it was that I did here. See if I can get that aimed right for you guys. There we go, found it. So there's where I've put my block of wood against the bottom of the mount for the transmission and the engine. And when I was taking the mount loose, making sure everything was loose and not broken, I kind of felt the engine droop a little bit in the back. So I'm gonna have to pick it up a little bit before I finish taking all of that out. But that is the hard part. The rest of this is just easy nut twisting, as my dad would call it. I need a beer. I need some pizza. This thing is broken loose and the project is, all the hard part's over. The hard part is now done. So I'm going to take that mount out, and when you guys cut back in, I'll be putting in the OEM mount under there, the one that we've filled. To get everything to line up correctly, I had to get back under the car. It's best if you have two people, and raise and lower the engine a little bit until you can get everything to line up. I highly suggest do not put the through bolt in until you get the back part on and everything. I put all the 3 nuts on the back, and I put them on just about a full nut on there. I didn't run them all the way down to the plate. And I did that so I had a little bit of room to manipulate the mount. And once I got the through bolt in, which took a couple minutes to get it aligned, then I went on ahead and ran all these down finger tight. Now the torque specs for these 3 bolts are, I think it was, the book said 58 to 65 pounds, and it was about the same for this. So I'm going to run everything down to 60 foot-pounds. Be sure to use your torque wrench. Be sure to put never seize on all of the bolts like I already have, especially if you're in a northern state. I harp on this in every video. Use never seize so the bolts don't get rusted on. So I'm going to torque all 3 of the nuts and the through bolt down, and we'll go from there. Now that these bolts are, let me move that out of the way. This is on top of your intake manifold, not where my stuff is. So now that we've got that all torqued in there, we're going to put the wiring harness back on. Just put the plastic cover on. And I'm going to tighten that down. I got to remount my sending units here. We're basically going to just go in reverse now. I loosened the dog bone bracket here. I'll bolt it back on and start slowly reassembling the car. So anyway, like I said, just make sure you know where you're going as you start to go about this project. Don't just jump around. What was on that one? Okay, I'll figure that out later. So here, the wiring harness, get that back together. The dog bow back on, and we're going to start to put things back on here so we can be reinstalling the intake manifold. And I have a new gasket to go get to put on here. Okay, so with the new gasket in place and the manifold sitting where it needs to be, I've run all the bolts down just finger tight. These do need to be torqued, and they have to be torque spec'd correctly. You can mess up the gasket, you can break the manifold, especially if you have one that's been smoothed, polished, and powder coated like this Signature Products intake here. And let's see, I've put my main vacuum line back on, And this one's the most important vac line. It's the main one. Yours won't actually go here. It's going to go down the bottom of the manifold back here, and it plugs into the brake booster over here. But I have a vac block, so mine runs a little bit differently. But this one's the big one. Without this, you don't have brakes. So I have, let's see what else I've done here. I haven't put any of my vacuum hoses. This is the fuel pressure regulator. It's going to go on the fuel rail. That's that back line. I don't think I've hooked up anything else yet. What we are about to do is, and I want to do this first and get out of the way, is the throttle cable. Now, I bolted this bracket back on the manifold when everything was off the car because it was easier, and I also removed this like you saw earlier in the video. So what I'm going to do now is put the cable end back in the butterfly linkage here, and then I'm going to pull the slack back, and if I can get you guys to see this, it will just slip in the notch here like this and click into place. And that will be the throttle cable dealt with. Much easier going on than it was getting off. After that, we're going to be back over here, and we've got to put all of our lines back on. If you're wanting to do the throttle body coolant bypass, now's the time to do it because they're already off. But I am not, so I'm going to be putting my coolant lines back on. We've got to hook up all of the sensors, the throttle body sensors, the EGR that's under here. If you're wanting to block that off, now's the time to do it. I am not as of just yet. Maybe in 6 months or something I'll end up doing that, but I've already had that off, so that shouldn't be a big deal for me to change when I get there. And we have the throttle positioning sensor up here that's got to be plugged back in. And once everything is hooked up, we're going to torque all this down and get this mounted the proper way that it needs to be. And our dog bone down here is still loose. We can't see it, but you can hear it. I haven't put it on yet. That's the very last thing I'm going to do because it has elongated holes in the bottom. And I'm going to tighten that from under the car, and I'll let you guys see that when we get there. So that's basically what we're up to right now. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the throttle cable. That was much, much easier putting all that back on. So throttle positioning sensor, throttle cable's on, EGR pipe down here is on, which I can reach by going under because of this manifold. Someone's gonna have to end up telling me what this sensor is, this one on the side of the throttle body, because I just don't know. Idle air control valve? No. I don't know. EGR is underneath here. That one's plugged in. Like I said, keep a rag in here. You don't want to accidentally drop something in here. Don't want to get these nuts down in the intake manifold. That'd be a catastrophic mess. We are ready to torque this on now. By the book says working the center out, alternating top to bottom, and you want 14 to 19 foot-pounds. I'm going for 18. So handy dandy, cheap torque wrench, etc. And let's torque this baby down. Okay, well that torqued down nice and easily. So the next thing we got to do, carefully, is this guy right here. Get that fuel going again. And if you need to change your intake, or your injector seals, now's the time. Get each one of these lined up as they go in there. Oh, just like that. Like a glove. Make sure that they seat down on top of the intake manifold like they need to be all the way across. And I like to check my fuel lines over here, make sure there's nothing in a bind. This upper, the return line, always seems to catch, especially when I twist it out of the way like that. So it's always a good idea. And I have a couple pieces of wire loom, the hard plastic kind, to kind of hold everything, or to hold it, to keep it from rubbing and chafing. So I've got a temperature sending unit over here. The wires can chafe there, and different things like that. And while we're thinking about it, we can plug in the knock sensor like so. And this is one thing that I say in almost every video I work on this car. Yours isn't going to be exactly like this. This has got more work in it than the car's worth, honestly. But you're going to have 4 bolts that actually hold your fuel rail. There's 2 here underneath the wiring loom, but I leave mine on. Then there's the 2 up here on top that I actually use to tend my AN lines. So I think these are 14 pounds on here, but these, there's no gasket here, so it's not that critical. I do the typical good tightness on them. And those are 12s, I believe, as well. Probably 14 since I'm on the camera and I'm probably wrong. There we go. We can run these down real quick. Plenty tight. There we go. So, for everything again, knock sensor's plugged in. Where is that line? Where'd you go? There you are. Our vacuum line for the pressure regulator on here. That plugged in. That's on there. I haven't popped this one in yet because my AN line is hard to get to there. So this job's really almost done at this point, honestly. Especially for you guys. I still have to bolt all my AN lines on, but really isn't that critical of a deal. So I got the PCV that's going to go down on here, and then yours is going to plug in here and go right on here. Then I have my crankcase breather and the top of my PCV come over here, and PCV and crankcase breather. And for you, this one's going to go onto your intake. So you can pop your PCV hoses in here now, and then you can get your intake put back on. And we're about ready to fire this baby up. See if we've made any difference in the vibration in the cabin at all. Something like that. Okay, so we are underneath the car, and this is the dog bone bracket here for the bottom of the intake manifold. So here's the bottom 2 bolts, and the top 2 are right up there. I suggest tightening these 2 first because they are not elongated, and bring those down nice and snug. This is just a support brace for the manifold to take the weight off the bolts on the head. So tighten those down comfortably tight, and then follow with these 2 right here. And that should be the rest of this project, and we can start the car. Well, I can tell you already, it was quieter in the car when I was turning it over. And it didn't seem to vibrate as much. It's so much smoother. Right there is when it used to vibrate the dash off. Mirror isn't vibrating up here. I think we did good. That ended up being worth it. That was worth the trouble. If it's that smooth on the road when I get to driving it, it'll all have been worth it. Although it's not as race car sounding inside when you turn the key and the whole car bucks yet when it starts. I do miss my yet already, but I think that's going to be well worth it in the end. So that was a pretty big project, but as you can see, very manageable with basic hand tools, especially if you've got a little bit of help. Switching that motor mount's not really that big of a deal. You just got to spend the time to get to it. Taking all of this off is pretty rudimentary. I've been taking all this on and off multiple times now. I've had the fuel rail off a dozen times. Oh, garage is closed. Smelling fuel. I've had the fuel rail off a dozen times, intake manifold off 3 or 4. So it's just an involved process to do it, but it's not hard. You just have to remember what you took off and how to put it back. If you're new to it and this is your first time, I just take pictures. I take a picture straight down on everything so you see what it looks like. Take some parts off, take another picture, take some more off, take another picture. I've seen a lot of people, they'll take certain bolts out, they'll put them in a little Ziploc bag and write on the bag where they came from. So the fuel rail, you put the 2 bolts in it, fuel rail bolts. Intake manifold bolts, all little separate bags, and it's just an easy way to distinguish what you've got and how you're going about changing things. You don't get mixed up, you have nothing left over. And as always, an empty parts can is a happy parts can.
Behind me you'll see a car.